So a while back, I made a video showing how I paint on metal signs using acrylic paint and all the techniques that I typically would use. And a lot of people watch that video, and I assume it's because people are trying to figure out how to paint on metal signs. Now, the results have always been pretty good for me, but I've never actually put these paintings through a stress test to see just how well they hold up. I bought some brand new aluminum signs here, and I'm going to do some experimentation in this video just to see how well these procedures really work and if it's even needed at all, frankly. I've got one of these aluminum alloy signs here, and I'm going to tape off one side of it to protect it from sanding and priming and all that good stuff. I'm going to walk you through the steps again, but a little bit quicker this time, so that anyone who hasn't seen that video knows what we're doing here. The first thing I do is I sand the sign. You could use a machine sander. I'm just doing it by hand here using a fairly rough piece of sandpaper. I want to make sure I repeat myself like I did in the last video to let people know that these signs, especially this kind here, are very sharp on the edges. So you need to be very careful when you're handling these things. I probably should be wearing gloves, but I always sand down the edges a little bit just to try to knock some of the sharpness off. The second thing I do is use vinegar to wash off any of the chemical residue that kind of comes on the signs. There's a coating that comes on these signs, and I use water and vinegar to kind of rinse all of that off. It takes a little bit of scrubbing actually to get this rubbery film off of the side even after sanding it, and that's what I was doing here. I was just repeatedly washing it to try to get all that stuff off. And hopefully you can see in the sunlight here just the effects of the sanding. It gives the sign a little tooth. Then the next step is obviously to prime the sign. So I'm just hitting it here with some Rust-Oleum Universal Primer, and then we let that dry a little bit. So now that that's dry, we can hit it again with another coat of primer, and we have a really nice surface to paint on here. So I've taken off my little protective sleeve, and you can see here we have the left side of the sign is all prepped and ready to paint the way I would normally do it. The right side has absolutely nothing been done to it, so it's exactly the way it came out of the box. I've got some acrylic paint here, and I'm just going to paint sort of a rainbow effect just to use a variety of colors on both sides. Same exact paint, mixed up exactly the same way. Gonna put it on fairly thick. I always paint pretty thick when doing these kind of signs. So when I was putting on the first coat of paint, there was a little bit of, there was like a little bubbling effect that was happening with the yellow paint and the red paint, where it felt like it wasn't going to stick as well as the primed side, but it actually went down pretty well, and I was a little bit surprised at how the paint adhered to the sign with no treatment at all. And once again, after getting the first coat down, I come back with the second coat just to make sure that the surface is covered pretty thoroughly. After the second coat of paint has dried, I put my little sleeve back on, and I'm going to take the sign outside, and then I'm going to coat it with some acrylic lacquer varnish. And I actually hit this with 2 coats. Again, let it dry 24 hours in between. The first thing I did to try to distress the paint was use some masking tape and just put it on a couple different spots, strip it up, and just see if any of the paint removed. Didn't expect it would, and it didn't. Then I came back with a much stickier duct tape, kind of like Gorilla Tape, if you've seen that stuff. And I wasn't quite sure if the paint would peel up with the duct tape, especially on the side that hadn't been treated, but it didn't. It held down just fine. So I felt a little bit like Mythbusters here. I rigged up this little contraption where I have this bottle with water in it with these very sharp wooden sticks taped to the bottom. And the idea here is that I wanted to try to keep the weight as evenly consistent as possible as I was dragging these little sticks across the sign, at least in the beginning. And it pretty quickly dawned on me that where the thicker paint was, that these wooden sticks were catching in the paint and were going to pull some of it up, and that's exactly what happened. So I was a little bit worried about this from the beginning, but I just went back and forth on both sides of the sign, trying to not use any additional pressure other than what was being applied by the water in the container. After a real good pass of this, what I noticed was that there was a lot more missing paint on the side that had not been treated with the procedures that I do. Now, they're very small, very, very small areas, but there were quite a few. And next I took the stick and just went with my hand and just really went crazy, scratching into the paint on both sides as much as I could, putting a fair amount of pressure. I came back with a paper towel and started trying to rub some of the paint off with water. just to see if it would lift up. And not surprisingly, the side that had been treated really didn't lift up very much. It only lifted up where some of the paint had been broken through. On the right side, where no sealer had been applied, the paint came up pretty easily, actually. And you could see it on the paper towel here. Now, when I was pulling up the tape that was holding down the sign, watch what happens to the side that doesn't have any treatment to it. So the red paint peeled up pretty easily there, and I guess that isn't really a surprise. Looking back now very carefully, the side on the left where I did all of the sealer and all the treatment, the protective coating actually kept the scratches from going too deep into the paint. On the side where I didn't do anything, the paint was more sticky, and I guess it was easier to affect it with the wooden stick from what I could tell. And again, although on the left side, a big chunk came out where the paint was fairly thick and the stick got stuck in the paint. On the right side, there were far more little spots that had flaked off. So it may be hard to see, but there's probably like 20 little spots where the paint had flaked off. Now, the last thing I did was I took this sign outside and I left it in the sun for about 3 days. And this may be hard to see, but the right side absolutely started to fade after only about 3 days in the sun. The procedures I do think help a little bit. I think the priming in particular helps the paint adhere to the sign better. I think the protective coating does make it, hold up a little bit more to damage than if you don't do anything at all. In a future video, I'm going to do a new painting on a metal sign. I'm going to use an epoxy resin that I've seen a friend of mine use that should seal in the painting really well and protect it like extremely well from this kind of destructive scratching and stuff like that. Yeah, so look for that video in the future and let me know if this was helpful to you or if you have any other tips or things like that you want to share. Yeah, appreciate it. See you next time.